Okay, I'll stay right here next to the podium, but
I'm gonna move these, okay?
Oh, okay.
You're okay. Stay there.
Okay.
I'm just
I
gonna
feel
turn these
like,
a little bit like this.
yeah, okay, here we go, perfect.
There we go.
I'll try to stay here.
There you go.
I feel like I get so restricted behind a podium. I'm also spend my days training my athletes on how to present themselves more forward and not hide behind things, so this is also why I don't like to hide behind a podium. So my name is Taylor Jacobs. I oversee our NILSU department at LSU. We launched NILSU with the launch of NIL back on July 1st of 2021. So all of the laws passed all in that same time, and the little NCAA guidance that we did get also went into effect July 1 of 2021. So we were ready at LSU and excited to use this opportunity to provide our athletes with resources in the NIL space, make sure they felt prepared and ready to go. So I'm going to tell you all about the program. We're going to talk about the impact on athletics. We're going to cover all the things, and then I'll answer any questions if you have any. But first, we really like height videos at LSU, so I naturally had to start with a video. This is the video we launched with NIL. We are working on 2.0 right now, but I am very hard on our creative team, so we haven't quite nailed it. But this is the video we launched with in 2021. Might have to hit it again, Grace. Yeah.
Wow. There's a story for you. It's one size fits all versus one of a kind. It's black and white versus purple and gold. It's 3 letters you don't get versus 3 letters you won't forget. It's being a star versus becoming an icon. It's following trend versus setting it. It's what we're trying to do now versus what we've done forever. It's cookie cutter and carbon copies versus honey badger and pistol pieces. It's reading a script versus writing your own. It's going viral versus staying viral. Just drop your hype video. It's being televised versus only television. It's everyone else versus LSU. I went to Louisiana because it was in the state of Louisiana I created my Shaq character. Y'all even know how that story is. Ain't nobody fresher than the mother.
So that was our little snippet of NIL, and basically the story behind that and what that meant was just we at LSU have been doing a lot of things prior to NIL to help our student athletes brand themselves and figure out who they're going to be after their sport is done. And we just now have the opportunity to help them maximize in the space and to profit off of their NIL while they're in school. So if you can see, name, image, and likeness is what NIL stands for. That is the acronym that we all know it by is NIL. The funny thing is with NIL, a lot of businesses and donors and people who wanted to get involved, and even some of our student athletes, they would hear the term and say, well, how do I do this? And I met with many businesses in the very beginning and said, have you ever worked with someone in marketing, or have you ever worked on an influencer agreement? And oftentimes they would say, yes, we've signed influencers, we've done social media campaigns, or we've had help in the marketing department. And that is really all that NIL is. It's just now you're using a student athlete. So there are additional rules that you have to be conscious of when it comes to working with a student athlete, but for the most part, it's standard influencer marketing. So our student athletes basically became little micro and macro influencers overnight, and now they are utilizing their personal brands to find benefits, I guess, in the NIL space financially or through gear or whatever it is. They'll often participate in trade deals as well. You can go next. So a little bit of how we got here. It really started back in 2014 with the O'Bannon versus NCAA case. So that was the first really big push where you saw the NCAA they sided against the NCAA in the courts and ruled in favor of the student athletes. So that was when we really started having conversations about how student athletes felt they were missing opportunities and how we needed to be thinking as institutions as to how they could better profit in the space. So then in 2019 is when we really started having in-depth conversations around NIL, and when I say we, it was NCAA level, conference level. We as institutions were having conversations about what would this even look like. That was really, in 2019, we gathered a group and we sat around the table, and our senior staff said, what would this look like if it were to happen? So it was a big if in 2019, but again, having those conversations. We formed our committee at LSU in January of 2020. It consisted of senior staff, some of our coaches, assistant coaches, directors of ops, marketing staff, sports properties, compliance, which is the role that I was in prior to NIL, so I come from a compliance background. And then in 2020, we decided, okay, the biggest conversation that we were seeing was that we needed to have, stay by the microphones. We needed to have a state law in place in the state of Louisiana because we were seeing California and Florida were implementing state laws, and so we signed with Altius Sports Partners, who became our NIL educational consultants, and they also helped us through the state law process. So we at LSU, with Altius and the help of other institutions around the state, came together to say, what would the perfect state law be surrounding NIL? So we drafted, and I say we, it wasn't just LSU, it was a variety of people, but the group working on that drafted the bill. It was Senate Bill 60 that passed July 1st of 2021, and it went into effect July 1 when the governor signed it, and that was also when all of the other state laws were set to go into effect and when the NCAA legislation was going into effect. Also around that time, you saw the Supreme Court rule in favor of Alston in the NCAA versus Alston case. That actually had nothing to do with NIL. It was confusing because it passed around the same time. But the Alston money is additional academic reward money for our student athletes. So it was an additional financial benefit for them that institutions would have to provide. But the biggest thing was, you again saw the courts rule in favor of the student athlete. So I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. But keep in mind, the judges on O'Bannon and Alston were the same. The judge was the same. And that judge is currently residing over a case right now that could have a huge impact on college athletics. So I'll get to that in a little bit. But then we implemented our Senate Bill 60 in July 1 of 2021. We actually amended the bill in July of 22. We lived in it for a year, and we decided that there were many things that we felt we were a little bit too aggressive in the state law space. So we went back in July of 22 and amended several things, added a few things to help protect our athletes, and that was, I guess, gets us to where we are today. So if you go next, Grace, thank you so much. So the NCAA guidance, the biggest thing with the NCAA so far is they're very confused when it comes to NIL. I'm going to be very honest. They don't really know what is best for them, for student athletes. I spent several days in Indianapolis with the NCAA and the NIL committee back in July. They had current student athletes, current coaches, current college administrators, and then their existing NIL committee. And you could tell that what they think need to be the forward motion is not what the student athletes want. Did this just turn off? Can y'all hear me still? Okay. Are these good if I keep going? Okay. So in that conversation and in that room, you had a lot of current student athletes actually saying, no, we really do want the institution more involved because these are our administrators, this is who we rely on, and the NCAA was in fact trying to get away from that. So we're having a lot more conversations surrounding what that would look like. But back in 2021, as I mentioned, all of these states had prepared state laws, and we got ours to where we thought it was great. We were so excited about it. It was going to be in line with what the NCAA wanted. So our state law was set to go into effect July 1 of 2021. On June, I think it was June 26th of 2021, the NCAA released 4 rules. These 4 rules for NIL basically could not be used as a recruiting inducement, which everyone chuckles at, could not be used as pay for play, the institution cannot pay the student athlete directly, and there must be quid pro quo. So the athlete has to do something in exchange for the money. So this state law that we had just created, we thought, okay, we're going to be at like the 5-yard line. Well, then the NCAA released that guidance that was so broad, it made our state law way more restrictive, and it took us back to like the 50-yard line is the metaphor that we always use. So when I say we lived in it for the year, that was why we lived in it and then determined, okay, the NCAA guidance is still very broad. So in July of 2022, that's why we chose to amend our state law, because we wanted it to be less restrictive and more in line with the NCAA. Things as far as amending, we just removed a lot of excess language that really didn't need to be in there. There was some confusing language that implied that certain people on boards at LSU couldn't be involved, but it was dependent upon the attorney that you used to interpret it as to what they determined. So we removed a lot of that excess language. We added a protection from public record requests for our student athletes when it comes to the transaction of their deals. Our student athletes are required to disclose the deals, and in that first year, I probably got 2 or 3 public record requests a week in wanting our student athletes' financials and who they're working with, and I just felt like that was private information for our athletes, so we implemented the public record protection, and then we added the ability for the institution to be more involved in the process when that guidance passes by the NCAA. So yeah, another thing with our state law, it does prohibit our student athletes from doing deals in the categories of alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and NCAA banned substances. This was unanimous amongst institutions in Louisiana, and the senators, everyone wanted to keep this protection in place. We've started hearing and having conversations with a lot of different student athletes, parents, administrators. It's interesting because LSU is allowed to have a alcohol deal, but the student athletes aren't. So we'll see where that leads us in the next year or two. But that prohibition is still in our state law. You can go next. So with NILSU, this was mentioned, but our biggest priority is to make sure we're educating our athletes, providing them with the proper branding, and then leading them to their next opportunity. So those are our 3 areas of focus: education, branding, and opportunity. You can go next. But with our education, we've had to be very intentional because, like I said, NIL happened overnight. I was actually up at midnight from going into July 1 of 2021, and I got all these text messages. I was probably up from midnight to 3 in the morning because all of our student athletes were getting DMs, and they were getting their first deals, and they were so excited, and how do they disclose it, and what do they do? So it literally, the switch flipped overnight. So how do we take what our student athletes are going through and channel that into education so that they feel prepared in the space? We were unique at LSU in the sense of I did come from a compliance background as my full-time job, but on the side I was familiar with social media influencer and marketing experiences, and so I took that and kind of merged all of that information to prepare our student athletes for what this would look like. We've done a lot of financial literacy to enhance that for our student athletes, because in our state law there is a requirement minimum of a certain number of hours we have to educate them. So our financial literacy partner used to come onto campus 1 to 2 times a year. She now comes onto campus 6 to 8 times a year. So she's meeting with our student athletes in person every other month, team by team, so that we can target the education for each group, as every sport is very different. Some sports actually want to start at, how do I start a checking account? What do I do with my savings? Preparing me for taxes. Some sports, a little bit more advanced, and they want to get into investments and savings and all of that. So she comes every other month. She has to meet with our teams. The minimum, they have to meet with her twice a year, but they have the ability to meet with her every time, and most of our teams do select to meet with her every time. She's available to meet with our student athletes one-on-one, and she also is available to Zoom with our parents. So they have access to her for any financial literacy education. We can only educate right now per the NCAA. I get the question all the time, can you please do my student athlete's taxes or my student's taxes? We cannot pay for the services to do the student athlete's taxes. That might be something that the NCAA changes in the near future, but right now it's strictly education. Again, the next thing is brand development. So making sure our athletes understand their brand, because that is actually what they are selling when they are trying to get an NIL deal. So what's important to you? What do you value? What do you want to represent? And then from there, who are the businesses that you would like to target or work with, and how can we help you meet that goal? Community engagement has become a really big thing. We've seen a ton of outreach from businesses and donors as to how they get connected with our student athletes or get involved. So we've tried to host many events on campus. If anyone has heard of or been to Build Your Board, it's our big networking event that we do every year. We will be hosting it in January this year, so stay tuned. If you come, you're about to get an email. But making sure our student athletes understand the power of networking, getting involved with people around them, and understanding that the same way they're going to pitch themselves in an NIL deal is going to be very similar to how they pitch themselves for future employment. And then social media training and NIL legislation, of course, stays in all of our education. But the brand is a very big thing. Obviously, we all follow LSU. We know LSU. We love LSU. Now the world really knows LSU, especially over the last year. Sorry. Over the last year, we've seen this huge increase of eyes on LSU. Our social media numbers have skyrocketed. Thank you. They've skyrocketed. We've seen a ton of increase in viewership and engagement and all of that through our social media platforms and what we're tracking as a creative unit. And so now how do we take that brand and help elevate our student athletes' brands? So we've been very intentional at helping them with the content creation, telling their stories, collab posts, because at the end of the day, that leads to the opportunities, which is what you see here. So we've seen, we're actually now almost at 2,000 deals disclosed since I've made this slide, and that's disclosed. I preface that because I love our student athletes, but they don't always disclose right away, so I have to track them down. It takes a long time. But we're at almost 2,000 deals disclosed, and we've seen anything from Raising Cane's to Nike to Puma to Biore, Taco Bell. Lots of really cool opportunities for our athletes. But I think what the biggest thing and biggest takeaway has been, we've seen them do some really cool things with their opportunities. So we have a handful of our baseball student athletes who actually give back a percentage of their money to charities in the area. We have several football players who are supporting their families solely and sending their NIL money home. We have Livy created the Livy Fund with the collective, and that's supporting female student athletes specifically. So they're doing a lot of really cool things and learning a lot of ways that they can give back and engage with the community. So that's been really exciting. So the next big question that we get all the time that people always want to talk about is a collective. So I will address it, and I will answer the questions that you have. But what is a collective? Basically, collectives formed as donor support groups that wanted to help support student athletes at specific universities within the NIL space. They did, in fact, start within our conference. Our conference tends to be the most aggressive. And so from there, of course, once one school had one, everyone had to have one. And so the donors all rallied together. We do have a collective, if you want to hit next, in Baton Rouge. They're called Bayou Traditions. Their goal is basically to raise money and provide NIL opportunities to student athletes. They are not a part of LSU. They are the official partner of LSU. They have entered into a partnership with our sports properties group. So in the same way that you see the official bank of LSU, they are the official collective of LSU. They are not run by LSU. They're not run by us. They are a completely separate entity, but they do work with a lot of our student athletes. So different ways that our athletes get involved with the collective. They're doing community service, appearances, autographs, social media posts. The collective works with different businesses in town sometimes, so sometimes it'll be like a co-branded thing with the collective at a business. Just kind of depends. But so getting into the impact on athletics, I think the past 2 years have gone a lot faster than what people anticipated. If you sit with most ADs around the country, they probably all would say we never envisioned being where we are now. And I can remember sitting with my boss at the time before NIL was passed, thinking about where we are now, I thought we'd be here in like 6 to 8 years. It has just gone so fast. I did not anticipate being where we are today this quickly, but we've seen a huge impact on athletics. The fundraising piece is obviously a big one. I just explained a collective is a third-party group now out raising money, directly competing with our Tiger Athletic Foundation. We are, if you're not aware, also raising money for new facilities, and Kim Mulkey really wants to redo the PMAC. So we are trying to raise those funds and get there and provide our student athlete scholarships, and that all comes through TAF. And now you have this existing third party that's raising for NIL, and it's becoming a direct competitor. So we're starting to see impacts, I think more so in the realm of donors being conflicted, but also, you know, who do I support, what do I support, what's more necessary. So we're seeing a huge impact there. And then the multimedia rights partner. This has also become a really big thing for the same reasons, just different groups, right? In the same way that the collective is targeting new donors, they're also targeting people who own businesses, and these businesses are partners of LSU, already giving their money to LSU, so now they don't feel they need to give to the collective, which is fair, it's a lot of money, and so you're seeing those conflicts there. Another thing that we see, if you drive around town, you see that there's a certain attorney who's gotten very involved in the NIL space. He is not our partner. We have another partner within LSU athletics who he has not engaged in NIL yet, but you can see the conflict there of all the attention one attorney is getting versus the other, and so trying to manage those relationships from a partnership standpoint. And then I would say the next biggest thing is just recruiting in general. Our coaches, I have, over the last 6 months, never seen them so stressed and impacted by something that, truthfully, they have no control over. But they all feel that they have to engage in this NIL game to keep up in recruiting. And that has been really difficult to navigate. I would honestly say that that's probably one of my biggest burdens, is how do I make sure all of my coaches feel supported? How do I make sure they all feel like they can be successful in the space? And how do I make it clear to them what's going on? That's very hard when we all operate under different state laws. So when a coach comes to me and says, well, this program at this school does this, I'm like, well, their state law is completely different than ours. So I can't help that because our state law prohibits us, whereas theirs doesn't. One example of that is alcohol. There are certain states that do allow their student athletes to do alcohol deals, and we don't. And so I have recruiting, competition between coaches here at LSU versus coaches in those other states, and that's a big thing. So how can we create a more consistent landscape? That would be, at this point, federal legislation, which I do not think we are going to get to at this time. So that leads us to the future. The federal legislation conversation is a very big conversation. There was a hearing 2 weeks ago. I still see a lot of inconsistencies in all of the senators. I am unsure that we will be able to get to an agreement by January, and that was their goal before they get into a presidential election year, because obviously our focus will shift to the presidential election. The competition in recruiting is going to continue until we can figure out how to level the field. The biggest thing that President Baker at the NCAA, his thing now is he wants transparency, because he wants schools to understand, this school says they're paying X, or this collective says they're paying X. Is that really the case? So he is trying to push for transparency in the federal legislation. We'll see if that helps or if it gets there. And then last is this pending litigation. So the House case, basically former student athletes are suing the NCAA for the value of their NIL, or what they would have made when they were student athletes. The same judge that's residing over this case is the judge that was over Alston and O'Bannon. So 90% chance the judge is going to rule in favor of the student athletes, and if that happens, then we will be looking at a revenue share model in college athletics. So that is a really big conversation. We have now shifted in the same way that we were preparing for NIL 2 years ago. We are now preparing for this revenue share conversation and what it would look like, because it could be as soon as next year or 3 years away, depending on how long this case takes. So that will be honestly crazy. As a former women's tennis player, it hurts my heart a little bit, because I feel like we are going to see the loss of sports. We're going to see smaller colleges not be able to sustain that model. And I think it's going to have a much bigger impact than what people truly realize. But we are looking at what that means, and we are going to prepare if we need to prepare. So I leave it up for questions. Go ahead. I'm going to take a sip of water.
Can there be multiple collectives? Can collectives be profit-making? And how do you do a quid pro quo. So Texas A&M has $40 million, and we're going to spread it all for just one signature for each student, or how?
So, yes, there can be multiple collectives. As an institution perspective, we prefer that there's not multiple collectives just because the collective here, they're the official partner, so they have the rights to use LSU IP, and we promote them in venue. So for confusion of fan base, I think most schools prefer that there's just one collective, because now if you're talking, right now, the Bayou Traditions is the one competing with Taft, but if there's multiple, they can be profit making, yes, if they can figure out. They're trying to get there. Trying to. Not quite there. You guys, I'll you first.
So you said that the recruiters come to you for guidance on how to play the NIL game, but it was my understanding that they're prohibited from engaging in NIL. Can you explain about how that works and what you meant by that?
So the problem is sorry. Would you repeat the question? So coaches coming to us asking how they play the NIL game, but they can't really use NIL as a recruiting inducement. So you can't use NIL. You cannot go as a coach to a student athlete or a prospective student athlete and say, we will pay you $100,000 to come here. You cannot do that. That is considered an inducement to attend the institution. You can, however, tell them about their opportunities and what they would have available to them at the institution. So for example, I meet with all of our recruits and tell them about our education and what our student athletes are doing, and they can see, the Livy Dunns and Angel Reeses of the world and Jaden Daniels and all the people that, if I come to LSU, I'm going to have this massive brand and I will have all these opportunities. You can have that conversation. However, you are seeing, and it's everywhere. We've seen so many violations turn into the NCAA that coaches are in fact saying, our collective will do this with you if you come here, or our collective is doing this with everyone on the team, so you will have that. And so there's this line of how do you stop it and how do you not stop it and how do you prevent it and how do you prove it, which is kind of similar to any other recruiting violation that existed before NIL, but a lot of our coaches are trying to figure out, I would say probably more of our smaller sport coaches or Olympic sport coaches are trying to figure out, how do I even sell NIL? Is it beneficial if they come here and can see that they can have this big brand? Is it not beneficial? How do we have the conversation with them? If, beach volleyball is an example. It's a big community here, but it's a massive community out in California. And so the California schools have a really big following when it comes to beach volleyball, whereas our following probably isn't as big. And so the coaches are trying to figure out, how do I compete with these California schools now in recruiting? So it's not as much about the inducement side. It's more in general, like a recruit just saying, well, I can go to this school and I'll have these opportunities. What happens to me if I come here? And they're trying to figure out what to say and how to navigate that.
So a coach could communicate that there are partners willing to pay a certain amount, but do coaches understand the NIL evaluation of specific players that they're recruiting, and can that factor into their communications?
Yes, it does factor into their communication. They do understand it because we probably look at their recruits and determine, hey, this recruit you're recruiting has $250,000 on social media. They could hypothetically do this on social media. Now, if they have 5 followers on social media and they really aren't athletically talented, it's a very true conversation that I would sit down with a coach and say, I'm going to be really honest with you, I don't know how much NIL money they're going to make because they aren't truly that marketable. So we have those conversations all the time, and yes, they will then turn around and have those conversations as well.
There was a story the other day, I'm not sure what school it was, that every student athlete, they might have been just for the football program, was guaranteed $60,000 plus, I guess, a truck, then everything else that they got with NIL. Is there a base compensation that every athlete?
There's not a base. That story that was not at LSU, by the way. That story is a good example of how something is being used as an inducement and no one's doing anything about it. Everyone on the team got a car. Again, it goes back to we can tell coaches, prospective student athletes, here's what current student athletes are doing, here's what they're engaging in, and here's the opportunities that you could have. So people use the car argument there. Well, everyone just happened to get a car, so if you come here, it could happen. But that is where the recruiting inducement conversation is difficult. There is no base to answer your question.
Maybe I didn't misheard you, but I thought you said earlier that the university compensates each student in a certain, is that
No.
academics or something?
They get their ALSA money is an academic award that they're gifted, but it's not us compensating them. It's an additional academic award they get in addition to their scholarship.
What is that? How much is that?
It's what's the value?
Yeah.
It's like $5,900 and something across the academic year, so it's split into 2 payments, semester and semester. It's determined on the institution determines how and when they pay it out. Most student athletes get it, but you have to qualify with a certain amount of academic criteria. You have to get a certain GPA. There's certain things you have to do academically. So that is truly separate from NIL. It's not anything related to NIL.
You mentioned that the NIL money that the player gets is confidential. You also mentioned coaches may be inferring or able to say what players are making. Is that a little confusing when one is confidential and one is public?
Yeah, so we don't at LSU encourage our coaches to tell the exact amounts of their current student
Do
athletes.
the coaches know?
No, not unless the student athletes told them. So they don't get that information. They know roughly how many we do provide them with a report of how many of their student athletes engage, kind of what they can expect from that, but they don't know the specific ins and outs of their deals. So only if the student athlete communicates it to a teammate and it gets back to the coaches, or if the student athletes tell the coaches directly. Or if the coach is really close with the business and the business says, well, I did this, that might happen, but that doesn't have to happen.
Can the collective say how much money?
Let somebody else ask them, so you don't repeat. The collective, is the collective allowed to give TAF a piece of what they collect?
The collective could give to TAF. TAF cannot use it for NIL right now, and TAF cannot give to the collective from a donation standpoint right now, because right now the NCAA is saying that TAF is considered a part of the athletic department or an extension of the athletic department, and the athletic department can't pay.
So, but the collective can create a deal with TAF where, you know, hey, if we bring in $100 million a year, we will pay that to TAF, however it is you want us to, $10 million.
Yeah, they could. They haven't probably gotten to that point yet, or they want to do that, but.
For local business.
I'm sorry.
What guardrails do you have in place to ensure that Bayou Traditions is in compliance and not doing deals that harm the brand, and that the money is clean, not laundered?
Okay, elaborate on clean and not laundered, because Bayou Traditions takes in the funds that are donated and then goes directly to the student athlete.
They don't have to disclose where it comes from?
Bayou Traditions?
Yeah.
Not to us. They don't have to disclose where it comes from. So they are a separate LLC, so they raise their funds and then they go and engage in the deal directly with the student athlete. We can't legally provide legal, I guess, resources to our student athletes, but I could take a contract and I can review it educationally and say, student athlete A, here's things that you need to look out for. But again, this is not legal advice. The collective is a pretty standard contract, so it's the same with most of the student athletes that they engage with. But most student athletes will bring it either to our office or to their agent, and their agent will handle the contract negotiations for them and add anything or do anything to protect the student athlete. As far as the funds that Bayou Traditions gets, we can't control where they're getting that from. And I don't have a way to do that because they're just a separate business. You were about to ask something you haven't asked me yet.
At a local level, with the local business owners. If we have a particular athlete we want to talk to, or if we just need an athlete.
Yep.
How do we go about it?
You can come to our office, and if you have a particular athlete, we can take all the information of what you're trying to do, and we can go present it to the student athlete. We would make the introduction with you and the student athlete. We're allowed to do that. If you just want a general athlete, more of what we would do is we would try to get the details of what you're looking for, and if you were okay with it, we would present it as an opportunity to maybe it's one sport you want to target, and we would let those athletes apply, and then those who are interested will give you those names and let you as the business decide who you want to move forward with.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Remy. Ken, you didn't quite answer the quid pro quo for the $40 million. Couldn't they say they have $60,000 per student, or because they would be outside of your control?
Yeah, so the collective,
And then how do they have a quid pro quo? I get $60,000 and I sign one football?
they have to do more than that. They have more deliverables, and it's the collective specifically. Is that what you're asking about? Or any business? Collective or any business, truthfully, they have a certain amount of deliverables that the student athlete has to meet dependent upon what they're paid. The lower the payment, for example, if it's $1,000, it's most likely one social media post. The higher the payment gets, they add deliverables. So there's community service stuff, there's autographs, there's appearances, there's different things. So specifically with the collective, the bigger deals that I've seen, the more deliverables the student athlete has on behalf of the collective. So they might be going to different events that the collective puts on. It might be signing multiple things that the collective eventually auctions off. But what we're seeing is the bigger the deal, the more deliverables the athlete has. So they do try to keep some sort of, if it's more compensation, there's more deliverables.
Can the collective talk to a potential recruit?
No.
They cannot.
Nope.
Can they contact the recruit?
What,
No. The collective cannot talk to a potential recruit. They cannot be introduced by us. If they have a pre-existing relationship or a way that they know the recruit, there might be ways that they're having conversations, but we cannot say, here, go talk to this recruit.
you had one?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about the potential for revenue sharing and why you believe that could lead to the end of some of the non-revenue or less revenue sports?
Yeah, and this is all, let me just say, like, this is just what I think. I don't know that this is actually going to happen. I feel like I should say that on record here. But if the current case that's in the courts right now, if it is sided with the athletes that the NCAA is to go back and compensate them for their NIL, the decision would be that moving forward, that would have to be the same thing. So the conversation is, how could we potentially do that without making student athletes employees, or do we have to make them employees in this revenue share model? That being said, I don't know what the official number would be. How do you put a value on a student athlete's, time as a student athlete? That's the conversation that's being had at that level, because some would argue that a student athlete at LSU might look very different than a student athlete at smaller school A. I don't want to call out a smaller school. So that we're unsure as to what that would look like. If student athletes become employees, it's going to be a very different thing, because we're going to have to move into employment contracts, and what does that look like? If there's a way to make it happen where they don't become employees and it becomes an additional part of their scholarship, similar to how the Alston Award happens, then we might be able to, navigate it that way. Where I think that it long term is going to have a bigger impact on other sports is that it's going to cut into an athletic department's budget. As many people disagree, and I don't want to, side one way or the other, but people say that athletic departments are rolling in all of this money, and truthfully, we're not. Most athletic departments are not profitable because of all of what we're paying staff. The amounts that we spend on a student athlete currently, on average, is like $150,000 a year with tuition, room, board, books, medical care, food, gear, travel. So we have a little over 500 athletes at LSU. So if you think about that, obviously coaches' contracts come into play when you're having that conversation. I know that's where there's this heated discussion. So I think you're going to have to look at, where do you cut costs? And does it come from salaries of the employees? Are we going to create much smaller staffs within the athletic department? Or are we going to cut back on what we're providing to student athletes? Those will all be questions that we'll be thinking about.
Piper, last question.
You spoke a little bit about the legislation that y'all worked on. Can you tell us who's primarily doing that advocacy work and what legislative changes you'd like to see on the state level in the future?
It was a group effort on the advocacy work. I mean, we were pretty involved in the changes, but we had several conversations with people on campus and across the state. And the second part of your question was what?
What legislative changes you'd like to see in the future on the state level?
Truthfully, on the state level, I feel really good about where we're at. I like our state law currently. I think it will depend on kind of what some other states do. We saw Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Missouri pass even more aggressive state laws that some would say prohibit the NCAA from doing from coming in and doing anything that's directly related to NIL. We have chosen to not go that route at this point, at least on our campus. We don't want to because we're trying to wait and see what the SEC and the NCAA do. So right now, we aren't really talking about anything. The conversation we've been having right now is I think our State Agent Act needs to be a little bit more updated, just in the sense of now you're having conversations about NIL, whereas they previously couldn't have agents, now they can. So I just want to make sure that all of that is up to date.
I'm not actually up to date on what that state agent conversation is. Can you elaborate on that?
So agents have to register in the state of Louisiana, and there's a state registration that they have to go through. And prior to NIL, it states in that registration that if they sign a student athlete, the student athlete would lose their eligibility. That's not the case anymore because they can sign a student athlete on NIL related matters. They just can't sign them to represent them professionally. So it works because in the language it says you can't sign them to represent them professionally, but I just want to make sure that it's, up to speed.
Thank you.
That is going to be interesting because I know in 21 when they passed it, it was state by state with the pretense that it would be ultimately NCAA. NCAA just So then is it going to get out of control?
Right now, it seems like y'all are way ahead of the game. And I just wanted to ask you, are y'all also looking at possibly doing this for like military and high schools in the future? If you're way ahead of the game?
I actually would love to educate high schools. I spoke with